Hi Year 11. This video is designed to help you with your understanding of flowers and flower structure as part of our pests internal. Now, why are we talking about flowers? Well, really simply, flowers are going to be the reproductive organ of any plant. So they're going to be involved in that plant being able to pass on its DNA and have offspring. Okay, that's what reproduction is. Your big idea here is pests are a big deal, okay, and they can have an impact on the plant life in an environment. They can do that by feeding on its reproductive parts. So if it's making pollen and a pest is eating that pollen and not moving that pollen, that's going to be a problem for that plant and for other organisms that have relationships with that plant in that system. Additionally, if a pest is eating a seed and it's not dispersing that seed, it's not taking it from one place to another place, then that pest is going to have a really negative impact on that flower and that plant and any other plants that have associations and relationship that kind of depend on that plant doing its job. Okay, so that's the why this matters. Now, when we talk about your basics of a flower, broadly, know your flower structure. So there should be some structures that you're recognizing from year 9. You've got yourself a stigma, which is going to be receiving pollen. You've got yourself your anther, which is going to be a site where pollen's going to be produced. You've got yourself a filament, which is a tubule that's going to be connecting and holding up that anther so that anything coming in, be it the wind or be it an animal, is going to be able to get that pollen coming in. You've also got things like petals, which aren't labelled but are important. They're going to be attractive to any insect coming in to be able to get any pollen that it might need to. Please also recognise that flowers are hermaphrodite, so they have male and female sex organs. You've also got your style, which is going to be holding up your stigma, so that's to support it in receiving pollen, and you're going to have your ovary, which is where your egg cells are going to be. Recognize as well that when that flower is fertilized, so it gets pollinated first, pollen turns up, and then the egg becomes fertilized by that pollen. When you've got that fertilization happening, you'll have a seed developing in this area here. So that's your basic flower structure. Now, from there, recognize the two differences in the processes that I've just named: pollination and fertilization. Pollination is your transfer of pollen from the anther of a flower to the stigma of usually a different, or preferably a different flower. Why preferably a different flower? Well, that will mean that you've got two different, ideally two different plants with two different flowers, and that will mean that you'll get greater variation in the offspring that are being produced from that, and that variation will mean that if there's a change in the environment, the offspring are more likely to survive. But pollination, most simple, transfer pollen from the anther of the flower to the stigma of a different flower. Do not confuse that with fertilization. That's the joining of the pollen to the ovule, to the egg. It happens in the embryo, so it happens in the ovary, that will form an embryo, and that leads to the development of the seed. Pests that get in the way of pollination are problematic for everything in a habitat. Just saying. Okay, animal pollinators. So you've got lots of examples here, some of which are great examples of things that you find in New Zealand, others not so much. So we don't really have flying bats in New Zealand. That's not really a thing. Fun fact, species of flightless bats is totally a thing. You also have things like insects or butterflies. These are examples of organisms that are going to take pollen from one plant and take it to another. So that's a critical role. And it's not something that's obvious on a food chain, because food chains are just showing you the flow of energy, what's eating what here. Okay? When we're talking about animal pollinators, they're taking things from one plant to another plant. And that's a critical role because those plants will be important to not just the organisms that are pollinating them. So very often you'll see this phrase keystone species in relation to a pollinator. Right, what does a flower do that's going to support it in getting pollinated by an animal? Well, it's going to have some bright colours. Those bright colours are really helpful in standing out and being attractive to an animal, because it's like, what's that? Oh yeah, it's a flower. Then you're going to have a landing site potentially for a pollinator, because you know what, flying's hard. You might want to stop for a little bit, conserve your energy while you're snacking on your pollen. Right, where you're getting some of that. So you've got that bright colours. You might also have scents to attract organisms towards that flower because they like really smells. You also get a nectary, okay, in some flowers. And a nectary is basically a source of sugar acting as a reward for a pollinator to come past. So as they move towards an anther or a stigma, they would basically, in moving towards that, because they're moving through to a nectary, as they move towards the nectary, they'll brush past an anther, they'll brush past a stigma, and that will now allow pollination to occur. Okay, other things you might have in terms of the adaptation that a animal might have. So you can often have a curved beak, which is quite common in many bird species. I think a tui is a good example of this. Very often as well, there'll be a long tongue to be able to let it get into that actual flower and get down to a nectary and to take sugar from